Hello, and welcome to our podcast, Challenging Economic Assumptions. We're here to talk about economics. It's constantly being discussed by the media, by your dad, by your colleagues, throwing around ideas about what is good for the economy, what is bad for it, and how the hell we can make sure it continues to grow. Yet where have these ideas come from? In this series, we'll be unpacking some of the underlying ideas which underpin traditional economic thinking and discussing how we got here and what the impacts and repercussions of these assumptions have been on our societies and where we can go next. Our hosts, Gerry McCartney, Professor of Wellbeing Economics at Glasgow University, and Carmel Williams, Associate Professor from the Centre for Health and Policy's Research Translation, will be talking with various thinkers, activists, and economists who have focused their efforts on understanding these assumptions and how they have shaped the way we live. In today's episode, we'll hear from Philip Heimberger, an economist at the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. He holds a PhD in economics from the Vienna University of Economics and Business and leads research in macroeconomics and its implications on fiscal policy and fiscal rules. His work focuses on the political economy of public debt and the socio-economic impacts of economic globalization. He has published many research papers which query the foundational economic models and theories, putting them under scrutiny and questioning the validity of their thinking. We hope you enjoy.
Hi, Philip. It's great to have you with us here today. Gerry and I are really looking forward to today's discussion, where we're really going to unpack with you some of the research that you've been doing around the dominant form of economic thinking today. Perhaps we could start with you describing some of your research around economic thinking.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Very much looking forward to the discussion with you. So let me maybe start by saying that, well, an important aspect nowadays in policy discussions is that policy making should be evidence-based, right? So we should have sound, robust research to inform important decisions to be taken by economic policymakers. But I think the big question is whether that's really typically the case. And so economics, so the field that I mostly work in, is much more empirical these days than it was, say, 2 or 3 decades ago. But this also comes with some problems because actually researchers may have an incentive to exaggerate the effects that they find in their research by selectively reporting the results that conform to dominant theories or are expected to be easier to publish, or by putting the results that they do not like simply into the drawer. So it can easily happen that policymakers are then basically misinformed by the results reported by single studies on a certain economic question or by the average effects in a certain subsample of studies. And so I think there is now mounting concern about the reliability, but also the reproducibility and replicability of reported economics research. And if you look at recent research, actually the evidence is accumulating that empirical economics is actually affected by problems like low statistical power, but also selection of estimates that confirm to favored hypothesis or dominant theory. And so what kind of part of my work is trying to do is to challenge the empirical foundations of economic policy prescriptions by using a specific toolbox, which is called meta-analysis.
So what is a meta-analysis, Philip?
Well, imagine you are trying to understand what the overall research says about the topic. So, like to what extent government spending decisions affect the economy, or whether monetary policy is effective in using interest rate hikes to bring down inflation. So to do this, you look at many studies that tested the effect of these policies, and you basically combine their results. And this combination is called a meta-analysis. So you do not only look at the small selection or not only at cherry-picked studies, but you try to put all relevant pieces of the empirical puzzle together. Yeah? So why do you do that? You do that because researchers, journals, but even readers of journals, they often prefer studies that show exciting results or expected results. Yeah? For example, well, monetary policy affects the economy exactly as our textbooks predicted. So these studies may be more likely to get published. And studies that don't show a strong effect, or studies that show that the effects of a policy cannot be distinguished from zero, they might not get published as frequently as other results. And they might be less interesting to journals, but also to media that report on specific studies. And therefore, they might get rejected, or they might not even be submitted by researchers.
So this kind of approach of meta-analysis, this was quite common in the health field, wasn't it? So we've got the Cochrane collaboration, which promoted the use of systematic review and meta-analysis to try and get clearer results for usually drug trials. But is that not a common approach within economics?
Well, nowadays it is much more accepted than it was, say, 10 years ago or 15 years ago. But actually, it was not easy to establish the use of this toolbox. So economics was quite slow in adapting or in using it. Was much later used in economics than in other social sciences. But there are now very important, I think, recent examples of why evidence from these meta-analyses are important, because these studies really show that there is accumulating evidence that empirical economics has problems with selective reporting of research results, specification searching, low statistical power, and that is an issue because actually conventional wisdom often informs policy. And if you kind of have a distorted view about what the impact of specific policies are, then that might also lead to, well, first of all, distorted policy debates, because some people can claim, well, this is the best evidence that we have, and therefore justify their decisions based on that. But it might in the end even lead to bad decisions in some ways.
So can I summarize, just because as a non-economist, it would be helpful for me to make sure I'm understanding how you're describing this, Philip, is that actually up till about 10 or 15 years ago, dominant economics wasn't using the systematic review process that those of us in public health have become quite familiar with to really look for all of the evidence available to determine where the strength of evidence sits in helping to determine what are the actions that we need to be taking forward and to guide policy and implementation. And that before this meta-analysis was used, that there was perhaps a risk that the evidence that was being picked up by policymakers tended to focus on business as usual and sort of the theoretical assumptions built into the the frameworks within the dominant theories taught in economic institutions. Is that sort of a summary?
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary. Let me maybe give you a recent example to back that up. So we have a recent study in which we compare the findings of influential meta-analyses, most of them published over the last 15 or 20 years. So over the period where meta-analysis has become more prominent in economics and more accepted. So we compare the findings of these meta-analyses to conventional wisdom about the same economic question or issue. So we ask basically, what do we learn from meta-analysis of economics, and how do the results from meta-analysis differ from the conventional textbook understanding of economics, okay? And when we compare the central findings of these meta-analyses to conventional wisdom, we actually find that for 70% of the research fields that we cover, the corrected effect size is substantially closer to zero than commonly thought, or even switches signs, so not a positive effect but a negative effect, or vice versa. And actually, significant publication bias, or selective reporting of research findings, is prevalent in most research fields. And when you compare the best estimate of the meta-analysis with the conventional wisdom from the reference study, then you actually have very sizable reduction in effect size, typically in the range of 45 to 60%. So as a rule of thumb, you can say that quite often the actual effect size is about 50% smaller than prominent studies or the conventional wisdom suggests. But there might also be some cases where this is a little bit different.
So that's really important, Philip. And I mean, the kind of assumptions or conventional wisdom, as you've kind of put it, these are really key to a lot of the economic models that are out there. Is that right? And I think you've done some work looking at some of the economic models within the EU, the European Union.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, some of the assumptions are very important for policy making or for public policy. Let me maybe talk about one or two examples from my own research, which where these assumptions have had a very big impact on millions of people. Let's think back to the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. That led to a big recession, not only in the US and advanced economies, but actually in most parts of the world. And many people suffered because of that, increased unemployment and so on. But a main legacy of the financial crisis was that public debt ratios and fiscal deficits increased a lot in most countries. And that,
just to be clear, what those are. So public debt, so that's the amount of government debt.
Exactly.
And
government
the debt
debt
ratio
increased. And the debt ratio is basically if you compare the gross government debts to the income in a particular year in an economy. So in that respect, it's a ratio called the government debt ratio. And the impact of the crisis was that while tax revenues went down a lot in most countries, but also government spending increased, for example, for unemployment benefits, public finances deteriorated. Okay, and then there was this austerity switch in 2010, which was to be seen in many parts of the world, but which was particularly stark in Europe. So basically, policymakers said, okay, now public finances got much worse because of the crisis, and now we have to go into austerity mode. We have to cut government spending, and we have to, in parts, also hike taxes. Okay, and a lot of that was actually justified by saying, well, if we don't do that, if we don't go for austerity now and for front-loading austerity and really harsh budget cuts, if we don't do that, then this might be an even bigger problem down the road for our economy, because these higher government debt levels may actually push down economic growth and therefore be a burden on the economy going forward. And that was informed actually by economic research, so two very prominent economists, Carmen Reinhardt and Ken Rogoff, they belong to the best known macroeconomists in the world. They had a research study in 2010 where they put out some historical evidence, and they claimed that actually, well, at normal government debt levels, so below 90% of the income of a particular economy, there is not a systematic link between government debt levels and economic growth, so not really a problem. But once you are above 90%, so once you go beyond that threshold, then things really become problematic, because then you have a negative growth effect, and there's a drag on growth. And that was used by European policymakers, finance ministers, but also in the UK and other parts of the world to actually justify this turn towards fiscal austerity. Okay, so they basically said, okay, there's serious empirical research, there's this one specific study, and this tells us we really have to go for austerity now to bring down the government debt ratio below 90%, because otherwise we will run into big problems.
And these
in the
were
future.
kind of really famous economists as well, weren't they? So it
Yeah,
really carried a lot of weight within sort of policy circles.
exactly. So they are really authoritative figures, you know.
I
One
think
of
the
them.
other thing that's really, sorry, Philip, the other thing that's really interesting that part of the story you've just told it shows the really powerful nature of some types of evidence being used to make really profound policy decisions that have profound impact on millions of people.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we don't understand that these types of evidence are used and really are driving how our societies operate. And perhaps it's really good to be out. It's really great the work you're doing, so we can actually start to unpack and think these things through in a more systematic and rigorous way.
Yeah. So the thing is that this was really an important justification back in the early 2010s. So very important to justify fiscal austerity policies. And then after that, you know, you had several empirical studies that claimed that they support the initial Reinhard and Roger findings, that, you know, that's really a big problem after government debt to GDP ratio of 90%. But then you also had some other studies which said that, well, actually, if you do the data analysis properly and if you consider whether it's actually robust, then you don't really find that. And so I did a meta-analysis, which was published, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, so relatively recently, where I kind of summarize all of the empirical evidence that we have on this question. So how do government debt levels affect economic growth? Given that this is so important to justify certain policies. And actually, if you do this meta-analysis, then you find that the evidence is really weak, that there is a universal threshold effect beyond which growth slows down. So you don't support the Reinhard and Roger finding, but you actually find that there is a lot of very specific data and specification choices that might lead you to this Reinhard and Roger result. But actually, it's not robust at all, and it should not be used to guide fiscal policy making. In particular, not as a universal prescription of how countries should deal with deterioration in public finances and an increase in government debt ratios. And from that perspective, meta-analysis can be important in showing that, okay, look, people, this is not a set of cherry-picked studies or just results from one specific study, but it basically tries to give you the whole picture. And by looking at the whole picture, you actually may find something that is quite different and also gives you different policy implications compared to looking at just one or two studies that might have a problem of selective reporting.
Yeah, and some of your work has shown how these kind of assumptions that were often based on very selective use of data and selected studies have made themselves kind of integral into quite important policy models, almost enshrined within legislation that then drive the decisions that governments can make and also the public perception of what is the kind of correct policy approach. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, I think these models and the assumptions that come with them, they are particularly powerful if you kind of enshrine them in law, you know. So if you have a set of legal prescriptions that are kind of based on estimates that come from these models, you know. And that's the case in the European Union when it comes to tax and spending policies of governments. So they are restricted basically by a set of rules. And this set of rules, to an important extent, relies on very technical estimates that are used to judge what's the fiscal situation, let's say, in Germany, in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal, or whatever European Union country. And actually, there is a big discussion about this underlying model that has been going on for years in academia, because this model that is used to assess what's structural about the budget deficit in a certain country and cannot be attributed to whether the economy is currently doing well or currently doing bad. Whether the estimates on this, whether they are really reliable. And actually, many papers find that these estimates are potentially biased, and that can lead you to also problematic guidance for tax and spending policies of EU governments. And in that respect, it's an example of a model that is of particular policy importance, and that really has a big effect also on the political process of how budget policies are done in Europe.
Yeah. So I agree, and we saw that in the UK, but we saw that across the world, as you say, after 2010, where sometimes it was, you know, this idea that we needed to reduce government debts and we needed to introduce austerity was part of the kind of legalistic framework. Sometimes it was part of the economic models. Sometimes it was just picked up ideologically, and it became this kind of mantra, didn't it, that we had to reduce public spending in order to promote economic growth. And I mean, Carmel and I have done work thinking about the public health consequences of this, and it's been disastrous. So life expectancy in many countries has stopped improving around 2012, and you can directly attribute that now to the introduction of austerity. So within a UK context, that meant cutting social security benefits for our poorest citizens. It meant massive cuts to local government spending, which spends on things like education and social care, really important services for people's lives. So yeah, the impact of these economic assumptions on public health and on a whole range of things within countries has been really, really profound.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, Philip and Gerry, I mean, I know, Philip, one of the other meta-analysis that you did was around the protection, the employment protection area, where you looked at, and I would love you to talk a little bit about that. And the reason I'm interested in that is really from a public health and equity perspective, that there's really strong economic arguments from quite a few from a range of political voices and parties, you know, really argue that we shouldn't be investing in employment protection policies. We shouldn't be looking at social protection, and yet we know from a public health perspective that it's really important. Social protection policies are really important in helping to mitigate the different circumstances and the distribution of opportunities that oftentimes different communities are have access to. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm very happy to talk about that. Thanks for the great question. So I have this meta-analysis on how employment protection legislation affects unemployment. So why is that relevant? Well, if you go back to, in particular, the 1980s and 2000s, that was a period where international organizations such as the IMF, but also the OECD, strongly pushed for labor market liberalization reforms. So basically, reducing or cutting employment protection legislation was a key part of that. It also consisted of other policies such as reducing unemployment benefits or decentralizing wage bargaining, but kind of reducing employment protection was key in that agenda. And back then, a key justification for pushing for labor market liberalization was that actually employment protection is very bad for the labor markets because it leads to higher unemployment. That was also something that was very prominent after the global financial crisis. So we talked about austerity and what budget policies did in terms of focusing on cutting government spending with detrimental health effects and so on. But when it comes to labor market policies, after the global financial crisis in many countries, especially those that were particularly crisis-ridden, there was a switch to also labor market liberalization, and in parts also cutting employment protection, because the idea was that this would be good for labor market recovery, so it would be helpful in reducing unemployment. So what I did in my study, in this meta-analysis on how employment protection legislation affects unemployment, is again, use the toolbox of meta-analysis, collect all the relevant estimates from the body of literature. This gives you a couple hundred estimates, including also the prominent studies from the International Monetary Fund and the OECD, but also many academic papers. And then you ask, okay, do we really find a negative effect of higher employment protection on unemployment? So does it really increase unemployment, given all the evidence that we have? And actually what you find is that this does not seem to be the case. So actually, if you correct for publication bias, you can no longer rule out that the average effect is zero. And you can actually explain that many of the studies that claim to show that the effect of employment protection on unemployment is adverse, and that they use very specific data and specification choices that might actually not be preferable. So in that sense, this meta-analysis was also an attempt to kind of challenge this policy-based or supposedly evidence-based policy prescriptions that reducing employment protection is good to reduce unemployment.
So Philip, you've described a pretty damning sort of indictment, I guess, on the economics profession and academic economics, because it seems like on all the kind of assumptions that you've looked at, the estimates have been, misleading, they've been a bit wrong, and these have had big policy impacts. Where does this leave economic models and the economic profession and how we think about economic policy making? What is safe? What is there anything we can trust there, or what are the clarifications that now need to be done? What are the new models that need to be built to better inform policy?
Well, I certainly think that it's important to develop critical thinking and to always ask the question also when you read in media articles about certain research results, not to take it for granted simply, and to ask whether the study replicates and whether there is actually additional evidence, preferably from a meta-analysis that backs this up. I mean, that can't always be the case, because sometimes when you think about climate policies, for example, there might not already be a large body of empirical literature that you could use to perform a meta-analysis. So single studies can also be important. But I think it's very important, especially if we want to discuss this notion of policymaking should be evidence-based, that we really ask ourselves how robust is the research that informs public debate, how robust are the research findings that are used to justify policy decisions. And in that regard, economists also have to be willing to critically reflect themselves. I mean, how does academic economics work? I mean, people that want to stay at university, they have to publish, they have to teach a little, but in particular, they have to publish. And they have to publish in high-ranked journals, And the question is, what can you publish there? And quite often there are incentives to choose some results in your research. You might also have, models based on somewhat different assumptions that show also different effects. But you might be willing to put that in the drawer because it actually increases your chances of publication. Or you think that it's more likely that if you don't show the null results, or if you don't show that a particular policy does not have a big effect, then this might not be publishable, and then it might not help you in further advancing your career. So these incentives you have to think about. And I mean, that's not only true about academic economics, it's also true when you think about the research that is produced, for example, by policymaking institutions, because they also, I mean, there it's typically even more clear that research departments of the IMF or the OECD, they typically publish research that is also supposed to give you some evidence, but also is often used to justify certain positions of these international organizations. So it's important to think about it critically, and luckily there is a toolbox that you can use to do that also systematically. But I think it also has implications for example, economics teaching and how students should be taught about empirical research in economics. So it should be clear, I think, for everyone studying economics that it's always problematic to just believe in cherry-picked research findings, and you really have to ask, even if that's published in the top journal. Actually, recent research papers in meta-analysis, they show that actually this publication bias is typically even more pronounced in the top journals in economics. Because there, the journal editors want even more exciting results, and they want things to conform even more to certain dominant theories. So it's also, not a quality, just a quality signal if it's published in top journal. I mean, some papers published they are very good, but I'm just saying that going forward, I think we have to have more of this critical debate about also research findings in economics.
So, but is it also that we need to be thinking about alternative economic theories? Because you're talking about the dominant theories informing and shaping the way the research is conducted, and then helping, they're using the theories, they're following sort of traditional methods, and then you're suggesting that occasionally they cherry pick the findings to kind of conform with the expected outcomes. But, we know all theories and all models are imperfect, but they're helpful in explaining the way the world works. But should we be looking at more innovative economic theories and models to help diversify the training of young economists, and also to diversify the range of discussions that can occur with policymakers?
Absolutely, I think that pluralism in economics teaching and research is important. So also considering different theoretical approaches and empirical approaches to a certain question, that can be very enriching and actually also give you a much more informative overall picture. I mean, we discussed a little bit the state of play in economics. I mean, it has always been like that, that a certain strand of theory, but also empirical approaches is kind of dominant or kind of the gold standard. And if you want to publish theoretical or empirical models that deviate from that, then it's quite often difficult to do it. Therefore, it's important also to push for possibilities in academic publishing, but also other publishing possibilities where you can actually use alternative approaches that can also inform economic policy making. So I certainly think that this is very very important. Also, when it comes to teaching, I think there should be also history courses for all economic students, and they should also have at least a couple of courses on research design, and also the philosophy of social sciences, because I think that's also something that is important when it comes to capacities for reflecting on research findings.
That's brilliant, Philip. Thank you for that. I just wonder if there's one other assumption that we've not talked about, but it's almost kind of so ubiquitous that we sometimes avoid it. So even within your meta-analyses, the outcome measure that's of interest is often economic growth, and that tends to be an outcome that politicians and economists focus on as a sort of measure of societal progress. Do you have any sort of critical thoughts, I guess, about the suitability of economic growth as an outcome?
Well, it's certainly problematic if there is such a one-sided focus on economic growth, or if that looms so large in justifying policy decisions. Because I mean, we know that, for example, it could very well be that you have even higher economic growth, but most of that growth actually just goes to a very small part of the population. So mostly the rich or wealthy benefit from it, and then what do most people have from growth? And then there's also this discussion, especially when it comes to climate and environmental policies, whether we can continue with this growth paradigm. I mean, in that regard, I think it's also important to have research on that. What would it mean, to have also systematically lower growth rates in large parts of the advanced world, but also emerging market economies, given that our system heavily relies on economic growth, also to kind of allow for what international organizations call sustainable public finances in the medium and long run. So there are many things you have to think about critically. But in general, I would say that policy debates in many instances would certainly benefit if there were not that strong a focus on economic growth, but if you also bring in other dimensions, such as social considerations, ecological considerations, and ask yourself what potential trade-offs also are between growth and some of these other objectives.
So if you were to give a bit of advice then to, I don't know, the head of the World Bank or the IMF or the Australian Treasury, what would it be about, their economic models? What would you urge them to change?
Well, I think what's very important is to acknowledge also for these international institutions that seemingly technical assumptions in economic models, they often inevitably come with normative judgments. And I think it's these normative judgments that we need to bring out into the open to also have a proper democratic policy debate and to promote, in the end, also accountable decisions. So also international organizations such as the IMF or others, they should not be allowed to basically hide behind their technical assumptions when they justify a certain course of policy or certain policy decisions. That's also partly how I understand my role as an economist. I mean, it's clear that many people in the general population will have a hard time in understanding why certain technical assumptions in economic models are important, especially when they are used in the policy context. But kind of explaining why that is relevant from a political point of view and why it may affect actually a lot of people, I think that's an important part of what we can do also as researchers.
Well, I think you can be exceptionally proud of the role you've made or you've played in making those assumptions much clearer and bringing evidence to bear on that. So I've certainly been using your work a lot in offering some critique to economic policy making in the UK. So yeah, more power to your elbow, and I hope you keep continuing to work on these meta-analyses into the future. So yeah, I think thank you hugely, Philip, for spending the time with us today, and thanks, Carmel. Good to see you again. And yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Hopefully this has added a little bit more to everybody's understanding about the underlying economic assumptions that we live and breathe every day in our respective countries.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Philip.
And that's it for today's episode of Challenging Economic Assumptions. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, and please share with anyone you think will be interested in this discussion. Thank you so much for listening.